Our third speaker is Christopher Johns, who is a professor and chair in the history of art at Vanderbilt University in Nashville. He works on the relationship between art and politics and the relation of both to art patronage in the 18th century. His books include a 1993 study on papal art and cultural politics in Rome in the age of Clement XI, a 1998 book on Antonio Canova. His many other publications include a very important essay on Rome in the 18th century that was the leading piece in the great exhibition catalog from the Philadelphia Museum of Art a few years ago. He's currently working on a book manuscript entitled The Visual Culture of Catholic Enlightenment, Papal Art in 18th Century Rome. Like everyone else involved in the proceedings today, Chris was a fellow of the American Academy in Rome, and we originally met over a dinner there, which I like to think of as being akin to that experience of the Café degli Inglesi that I mentioned earlier. His talk today is entitled Piranesi and the Fabrication of Rome in the European Imagination, Le vedute di Roma and le antichità romane. Christopher.
John, thank you very much for the introduction. I am delighted to be here and very honored to be speaking with two scholars whose work I admire tremendously. If you'll forgive me, I'm going to read a short statement to make sure that I get this out, and then I'm going to revert to a less formal style of presentation. It is perhaps difficult for us in this era of mass media and imagery overload to appreciate the profound impact of visual culture on audiences in the 18th century. Since only a small minority of people ever traveled very far from home, and since encounters with works of art were relatively rare, images usually made a much deeper impression on their beholders than is often appreciated today. The enormous output of graphic art by the Venetian architect, designer, antiquarian, polemicist, and art dealer, Giambattista Piranesi, is a case in point. His superb etchings, encountered either as individual prints or more frequently in bound collections of related images, did much to formulate the mental image of the city of Rome in the minds of his European contemporaries. Even today, those who have not been to Rome but have a mental image of its enormity and impressiveness may owe more to Piranesi's visualizations of the Eternal City than they imagine. Those more familiar with Rome may also experience the city visually through a lens at least partly clouded by Piranesi's prints. In sum, the massive graphic output of one of the 18th century's most influential artists continues to position Rome in our visual imaginary. This morning, I would like to discuss etchings from two of his major series of prints that we've heard about quite a bit already. The Views of Rome, begun in 1748 and continued well into the 1760s, and Roman Antiquities, beginning in 1750. Images from these two publications deeply influenced European perceptions of both ancient and modern Rome and provided a polemical basis for those who championed grandeur, magnificence, opulence, and copious ornament as the touchstones of ancient achievement that could serve as an example of perfection in modern art and architectural production. I'm a technical Luddite, so let's pray. Let us pray. Here we are. Okay. I'm going to cover a little of the same ground that John Pinto covered in relation to the idea of scale, both not only as a form of artistic creativity, but as a polemical tool to create an idea of Rome that would transcend the images themselves and then position themselves in the imagination of the people who actually saw them. I'll also talk about briefly the political aspects of this type of this use of scale. I'd like to start with this view from the Views of Rome. This was a print, an etching produced in the 1750s by Piranesi, and it's the view of the Piazza del Popolo. Many of you who've been to Rome are very familiar with this space. It's probably an appropriate place to begin because this urban space was the first area encountered by most tourists who came to Rome in the 18th century from the north via the Via Flaminia. This is sort of your point of entry into the city. Its urban sophistication set the tone for visitors' expectations of grand buildings, wide avenues, and a rational organization worthy of a major European capital. And that, of course, was the point of this urbanistic project from the late Baroque. This is what popes in that era were trying to do, was to create something that was impressive to the eyes of the foreigners. I call your attention specifically, and let me see if I can do this. Yes, here. Wow. Surprised myself, thank you. I call your attention to the much restored Egyptian obelisk in the center of the Piazza. In addition to the sort of great monument of late Baroque urbanism that you see with the twin churches that were designed to set off the three major avenues that lead to different parts of the city, the obelisk is here partly to remind you that Rome is basically a fabric that weaves both the ancient and the modern together. So you have both of these very present in Rome that still, according to the people who are, of course, creating these spaces and placing these objects in them, is still very much a vital place of artistic invention rather than something that's receded into an obscurantist past and resting on its laurels. Already visible in Piranesi's views of Rome, like this one, is a highly mediated sense of increased scale, especially in the aspect here of an almost infinite, expansive space in which the three major Roman avenues recede into an almost eternal distance. I'd like to contrast Piranesi's sense of scale and this sort of almost infinite expanse of space of the city with a different kind of mediated view of the city. Here, an oil-on-canvas painting from 1742 by Gianpaolo Panini. This is also a view of the Piazza del Popolo. This is the same space, obviously, but is revealing of different artistic intentions. View painting, of which this is an example, versus a more polemical purpose, which is what many would argue Piranesi's prints are at least partly trying to do. Panini was professor of perspective at the French Academy in Rome, and he here deploys a more accurate sense of scale and closes off the background to give a sense basically of the finite area that we see here. And it's, as you can see, the point of view here has been elevated. The same three avenues that go off here towards St. Peter's, here down towards Piazza Venezia, and over here towards Piazza di Spagna. Here's the church at the top of the Spanish stairs, just for your point of reference. This is clearly a more sort of accurate architectural rendering, still, though, very much mediated. I'd like, though, to call your attention also to the figures here that we see in the much more confined square. Panini's figural element gives the scene a strong genre aspect, both naturalistic and picturesque, that's largely attained through the much greater detail in the human element. And this is something that very much sets him apart from what Piranesi usually does with his figures. View painting has many similarities to the modern postcard that records a characteristic aspect of a famous place. And this goes back to something I said in the beginning about the rarity, the relative rarity of visual images for 18th century people. They didn't have access to photography, obviously, and its many byproducts. So something like this, in many ways, is a form of stand-in. Another view of the city of Rome, again from the 1750s by Piranesi, an etching, is called the view of the Campo Vicino. This is what 18th century people called what we now, the area we now call the Roman Forum. The cow pasture is what this meant because people had, there were water troughs for livestock and animals, markets were conducted there. So it's logical that this space would be so designated. Like the previous print, the view of the Piazza del Popolo by Piranesi, this scene stresses the panorama, a sweeping vista, almost a panopticon, where you have this sort of eagle's eye view of a wide, expansive sweep of space that lends it an almost romantic sense of magnificence, endowing the decayed ruins of empire with a still very potent visual impact. Remember going back again, and I'll show you a scene in a moment of another Panini, of the tiny figures that you see here. Drat. There's the anticipation. I told you I'd screw this up before it was over. Anyway, here we go. Figures here to give you, again, the sense of scale that John Pinto was talking about. In Piranesi's view of the Campo Vicino, the figures are really only staffage. They simply are there for a sense of scale and to show a human element, however repressed and underemphasized. They do help, however, to enhance the sense of grand scale and take the scene, I would argue, out of the diurnal whirl that Panini gives us in his view paintings to elevate them to a more sublime, again, romantic type of place. And here's the same place, again, in an oil on canvas painting by Panini from about 1748. Figural specificity here gives it, again, the genre quality that we saw in his view painting of the Piazza del Popolo. And again, I would argue that this genre aspect is something that ties it to a present, an identifiable present that would have been recognized by contemporary audiences in a way that may not necessarily have applied to Piranesi. And I draw your attention also here to this, oh please, let me go here, to this very well-dressed couple who are in the lower left, sort of looking and taking the scene into account. What's missing here, compared to the Piranesi, is the much lower point of view. And this model couple here, probably tourists, they're dressed well. They provide us a model of spectatorship that allows us as viewers of the painting to enter into it in a much more sort of normal, a normative type of way. Whereas Piranesi deliberately distances it from us in order to make us more impressed with what we're actually seeing. I couldn't resist bringing in a view of what this area looks like today. What we now see in the Roman Forum owes much to fascist era archaeology, which rejected the model of the ancient and modern woven into a single urban fabric in favor of isolating the ancient and removing it as far as possible from its context, rather like the notion of placing a statue on a high pedestal. What this achieves, and what we're looking at here, is something that never would have existed at a moment in time. These are buildings from different eras that have been excavated down to the lowest level possible. The idea, though, in Mussolini's case, was to try to show the grandeur of ancient Roman civilization and the modern Italians, the modern fascist state, as its worthy inheritors. In fact, what it does is completely distances and separates this into an archaeological zone that it becomes a point of spectatorship, but from the outside. And those of you who have been there, many of you, I'm sure, feel the sense of kind of isolation from what you're looking at. Impressive as it may be, it's off-putting. It distances you from what one would suspect this type of archaeological reconstruction would really be trying to do. Scale can be worked in very many ways, and here we have the opposite of what Piranesi usually does with his figural element vis-a-vis the built environment or the ruins of antiquity. This is another painting by Panini. It is one of these sort of architectural types of paintings. We see St. Peter's and other monuments you're familiar with. The specific title, though, is The Arrival of Charles III at the Basilica of St. Peter's on November 4th, 1744, painted by Panini the next year on commission from King Charles III of Naples. Scale may be deployed differently for different purposes, as I mentioned. Here, Panini dramatically increases the scale and stature of the king and his entourage at the expense of the built environment. Note the smallness of the obelisk and the Basilica of St. Peter's facade. Anyone who's been there or watched the recent show of the smoke and all of that realize that this is basically the buildings here have been shrunk down in order to enhance the political importance of the figure represented, particularly King Charles, who comes in here with his entourage. Charles III was about 5 feet 1 inch tall. He's shown here on a colossal horse, and it's almost as if he were going to trot into the front door of the basilica here. He would have to take off his hat in order to have it not knocked off. Of course, this is wildly exaggerated, but it's done for a political purpose, that is to enhance the king's stature and reputation, and just to remind the Pope, Benedict XIV in this case, whom he had just visited earlier in the morning before he came to St. Peter's, to remind the Pope that he is a king in his own right and that he is a person to be dealt with. So there's a church-state business going on here in which the church definitely comes out in second position. And this is even stranger when one considers that Panini knew better. As prospector of architecture at the French Academy in Rome, one would assume that he recognized what he was doing, and that I suspect strongly that this was part of the patron's input into this painting. We've heard the term capriccio in both the previous talks, and I'd like to sort of explore that a little bit in terms of Piranesi's use of scale. And I do this again by turning to the other option. This is another painting by Panini. It's called Venetian Capriccio with a Sibyl preaching, an ancient prophetess, from 1749. The capriccio, or the caprice, was developed in Venice in the late 17th century, but became a wildly popular genre of painting and other types of imagery that enabled artists to show off their invention, fantasy, and aesthetic imaginations. And again, call to mind here that Piranesi was a Venetian. The artist creates here a fantasy image still imbued with decayed grandeur, but that retains a naturalistic human scale and continues to call specific attention to the figural elements in the painting. Piranesi's prints, on the other hand, often contain elements of the capriccio, in particular the exaggeration of scale to the point to where it really stresses credulity, even if you're familiar with the monument or the space. And allows them to be transported into an imaginary sphere only indirectly connected to empirical reality. The Venetian Capriccio, in its origins, is basically a collection of different kinds of buildings, real and imagined, sort of arranged like Cézanne would arrange objects on a table for a still life. That is, put together from different places for their formal and aesthetic qualities, rather than any kind of documentary purpose or to record an actual place. But I would also argue that at a certain point, Piranesi's views of Rome, that is, real monuments, cross this line into the realm of the capriccio, where you're basically dealing with a hybridity of an object that you recognize, but that you can't recognize in its sort of more naturalistic forms because of the exaggeration of scale. In this view, from the views of Rome, again from the 1750s, we see this is the one, the column of Trajan and the Church of the Most Holy Name of Mary, Santissima Nome di Maria. These are configured in this way in reality. This is a space they're quite near to one another. The church was built in the 1740s, and of course the monument itself is from the 2nd century of the Common Era, the column. This etching is characteristic, I would argue, of Piranesi's idea of showing a visually balanced view of both ancient and modern Rome, somewhat privileging the ancient, but indicating the viability of the contemporary. Roman magnificence, and that's a word that appears over and over and over, both in the 18th century and in subsequent evaluations of Piranesi, it's a term he used himself, obviously. Roman magnificence is visualized through enhanced scale and an expansive sense of palpable space around the monuments. What I would also point out here is that what you're looking at is basically a polemical statement, partly, on Piranesi's part to stress and to insist upon the continuing artistic and sort of creative vitality of Roman architecture and art in the 18th century, in an era when it was being increasingly attacked as being retardataire, old-fashioned, and out of touch, partly because of critiques of religion and the church, but then sort of imposed upon monuments, imposed upon the monuments that were created and curated by the papacy. Two more of the other option open to Piranesi, and Professor Pinto said a lot about this. I'm showing you two images now, the view of the pyramid of Caius Cestius at left and the column of Marcus Aurelius in the Piazza Colonna at the right. These are more, the pyramid of Caius Cestius is more isolated from its environment. That is, it's sort of held up as a sort of a symbol of ancient achievement. Here, a pyramid done in imitation of Egyptian forms erected in Rome. And on the right, where you actually see the monument surrounded by the buildings in the Piazza Colonna. Again, this ancient and modern coming together. Excuse me. This manner of presentation shows a subtle polemical side to Piranesi, who here who may here be rejecting the chorus of complaint about Rome being a priest-driven city resting on its laurels while its patrimony is polluted by monkish smoke. This is the language used at the time, and as I'm about to mention, this type of critique was becoming increasingly common by the last third of the 18th century and would ultimately be used as justification for the systematic looting of Roman collections by the French in the revolutionary and Napoleonic eras. There was even a plan to remove Trajan's and Marcus Aurelius's columns from Rome to Paris, a feat that fortunately proved beyond French engineering abilities. You can read the documents, particularly about the one, Trajan's column. They seriously were going to try to do this. Thank God it didn't work out for them. The idea of the fabrication of Rome, which is part of my title, is not only a visual fabrication in terms of graphic production and in the production of three-dimensional forms of material culture based on these types of designs, but it's also the fabrication of Rome in the imagination. As John pointed out, many people who went to Rome were quite disappointed when they saw the actual monuments that they knew only through Piranesi because of his sense of grandeur of scale, and many of these things to them looked rather puny and relatively unimpressive. The reason why is they're not holding the Piranesi print in their hand and then looking like this. It's not that kind of comparison. What those prints had done was created an idea of Rome that exists only in the mind, only in the imaginary. And when that is contradicted by visual evidence, this creates a type of slippage between what you think you know and what you're actually seeing. And this, I think, is a very important distinction for us to make. The dissemination of his graphic production, he was a very famous artist by the year 1758 when Pope Clement XIII, a Venetian, was elected to the papacy. But it was Clement XIII who, more than any other pope, actually helped to popularize Piranesi's ideas across Europe because it was his habit, this pope's habit, to actually present large, beautifully bound luxury volumes to visiting grand tourists, the people who mattered. This is a society that believed that examples are set at the top and then filter down. So if you basically convert the elite and sort of promote your ideas with the elite, this of course then becomes the standard reaction to your position. And this is what the Pope was trying to do by the dissemination of Piranesi's publication. This is the coronation portrait by Anton Raphael Mengs of Pope Clement XIII. And it may not be too much of a stretch to see this incredible sort of emphasis on material stuffs, patterns, fabrics, and things like that as having a rather Piranesian aspect to it, and almost a decorative horror vacui that maybe suggests what Clement XIII, this was his preferred portrait, by the way. There are others of him that were made at the same time. And perhaps there was an aesthetics sort of sensibility of Clement that admired Piranesi's work as much as the Venetian connection, which of course arguably is very important. It was during the reign of Clement XIII that the Antiquità Romane, Roman Antiquities, one of Piranesi's major series of graphic images, reached the height of its popularity across Europe. And this was again partly accomplished by the presentation of some of these volumes to visiting worthies and grandees from various parts of Europe, but above all from the British Isles. I'm showing you here the frontispiece from the second volume that's dedicated to tombs and ancient mausolea. This ambitious series of etchings is devoted to antique monuments and is characterized by even greater distortion of scale in order to underscore ancient Roman magnificence. Again, this term magnificenza that appears over and over. And in particular, Piranesi wished to stress the magnificenza of ancient architecture, engineering, and design. Antiquità Romane has a more pronounced Roman sensibility than the Vedute di Roma. Despite the fact that seems counterintuitive, but I think it is the case in terms of Romanità, this idea, again, this mental image of what Rome is and what Rome was. The frontispiece indicates a partial merging of art and nature, as a column is shown partly blasted away to suggest the trunk of an enormous tree, the backside of which contains the volume's title. And you can see that here in the title, and those of you whose Italian is up to it can actually translate that. I won't bore you with it. And we saw this one before, and John stole a little of my thunder, but I want to emphasize his point about relation of scale and this even greater, sort of much more imaginative and sublimely romantic aspect of the Antichità Romane than you see in the Vedute di Roma. This is an imaginary view of the foundations of the mausoleum of Hadrian. This particular one is from 1756. What is visualized here exists largely in the artist's imagination and is a tribute to the marvels of ancient Roman engineering. The Castel Sant'Angelo, as the superstructure is now called, is only vaguely indicated above, just this area right up here. The subject is the imagined substructure, a visionary rendering of the unseen. Making visible what is invisible was one of the great artistic quests of the entire 18th century, and Piranesi's art does this. This is a form of archaeological and architectural autopsy. That is, there's no way, as John pointed out, that no excavation had revealed anything even remotely this detailed. But the idea that if you dig beneath the surface, if to reveal what cannot be seen on the surface, that somehow you come to a more profound understanding of what it is. And I think the polemical aspect of this is to show the unparalleled, the peerless quality of the Roman achievement. Piranesi, although a Venetian, was the great voice for Rome, for its continuity, for its continued dominance in European art, design, preservation of patrimonies through the invention and curation of museums. In other words, as a great champion of Rome, the idea here is basically to visualize, again, for the imagination, is to visualize something that could not really be seen, but at the same time, it could leave an indelible impression on the imagination that can never be erased. I mean, anytime if you've seen this and studied this print, when you go to see the Castel Sant'Angelo, I immediately think about what is underneath it and the sort of this substructure that Piranesi had given us in the print. You wonder, and I'm sure Piranesi wants us to do exactly that, you wonder what these kind of, how this is actually structured, what possible tools, mechanics, engineering devices, tools could be used to actually construct something like this. He wants you to be overwhelmed and to leave a sense of awe and mystery about how these things are accomplished. Can the modern world ever attempt or achieve this kind of grandeur? And you also, I have to wonder when I look at this, look at these little dudes down here. Look at this one in particular. I mean, did he read Gulliver's Travels? I mean, these really are sort of sub-Lilliputian in scale. And again, this sort of the stretching apart of sort of credulity in a case like this. He doesn't expect people to believe that this is actually what is underneath. What he wants to do is argue that it could be what is underneath because the Romans, the ancient Romans, were capable of doing exactly this type of thing. This is another scene from the Antichità Romane, an imaginary view of the Via Appia Antica. This print is a megalomaniacal visionary rendering of ancient Rome's most important road, the Via Appia Antica, that linked the capital to the city of Naples. It still sort of does. I mean, you take your life into your hands even going on it, but it still technically does. The highway holds a charioteer. Here he is here. Who drives through a bedizened heap of buildings, statues, architectural fragments, vases, and other antique forms, and is highly remarkable for a pronounced sense of horror vacui, which we've seen in the other two presentations, is something that's characteristic of Piranesi's sense of design. You could spend an hour easily looking at all the objects that you see here. Things that sort of rival the candelabri that we've seen already, the Warwick vase in a different kind of form. In other words, these sort of melange of architectural, totally imaginary architectural forms, large busts, fragmentary figures. This one over here is one of my particular favorites. I mean, this would have put the colossal Nero to shame. Anyway, these types of fragments basically are part of his vision of the idea that Jeffrey was talking about of more is more. Fragment and fantasy comes to mind also, and I'd like to leave you with my little alliteration here, bigger is better. Thank you.